Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and I've got a great book recommendation for you today. Now, I often get asked about books that I recommend people to get into, to read, for getting into HEMA and learning more about HEMA if they're just interested in learning a bit more about historical European martial arts, or indeed if they're preparing themselves to actually physically get involved in training, or they're new to training and they want to broaden their knowledge. And HEMA is one of those things, it's actually quite difficult to point people towards individual sources until you know what their kind of specialism is going to be. And how do you decide what your specialism is going to be without knowing a little bit more about different sources and how they compare and different weapon sets and different periods and stuff? So it's kind of actually quite tricky. And over the years, there have been a very small number of books that have tried to look at HEMA holistically in a big picture, kind of big perspective context, to try and, I suppose, introduce the reader or the student to HEMA as a whole. And this is one of those books that actually attempts to do that, and I think it does a pretty good job. Now, full disclosure, this has been sent to me for free to review, but I haven't read through the whole thing yet, but I have read through sections of it, and I'm pretty impressed. Yeah, it's a pretty good book. And do I feel comfortable recommending this to someone who's wanting to just learn more about HEMA, or someone who's just generally interested in historical warfare and weapons and, a good book for the shelf? Yes, I recommend it for that. Do I recommend it for a new student in HEMA? Probably yes. I'll go through what the sections are in it in a second, but I think it gives a pretty good overview picture. And just thinking about my own students, for example, in either of my classes, obviously we focus on two main systems. We focus on British military sabre, and we focus on Fiore de Liberi's works, primarily the longsword and the dagger material, but we do look at the other sections as well. So, funnily enough, although I've got students who might have been training with me for years, some of them don't necessarily know very much outside of the systems we teach. And I suspect that that's probably true of absolutely loads of HEMA practitioners all over the world. And this is written by Eric Lowe, who is a US HEMA practitioner, and it is called The Use of Medieval Weaponry. So therefore, this is constrained to some extent, although it does go well into the Renaissance, so it does talk about rapiers, for example. So although it's called The Use of Medieval Weaponry, it is really applying to medieval and Renaissance. And additionally, I would say it doesn't cover anything beyond that. So, for example, most of my students study obviously Victorian and to some degree Georgian military systems, both sabre and bayonet, sometimes cutlass. So that's not in here. You're not going to find anything about that in here. So it's purely for medieval and Renaissance, really. Okay. So first up, it is illustrated to some degree. It's not hugely illustrated, it's mostly text, but it does have, some of the common plates from treatises you'd see. It's got Talhofer there. It's got quite a bit of Talhofer, actually. And again, more Talhofer there. These are different sections, but Talhofer is one of those easy to use sources, and not all of these sources are easy to use because of copyright. And it also has some original artwork, which is actually people from Eric's club, I believe, people he trains with and students of his who've been illustrated. More Talhofer come through here. Here you go. Here's another example of a technique with a rapier and cloak that's been illustrated with people from his club, presumably drawn from photos, I would imagine. And again here. So it illustrates certain key techniques, but as you can see, it's not massively illustrated. It's not a picture book. It is primarily a text book. But that being said, it gives I think it's broken down in a good logical way. So just going through the chapters, chapter 1 is we're all sword geeks here, so it's a basic background context to I suppose why people would study this in the first place and who studies it. And then chapter 2, how do we know any of this? So that's talking a little bit more about the source material and how interpretation, translation and transcription, translation and interpretation works. And that's an important point for me to mention as well, is that inevitably any books like this involve interpretation. So when Eric has spoken about techniques, there is interpretation involved. Now, Based on what I've read so far, I wouldn't say that I'm not saying that I don't, but I wouldn't necessarily say that I agree with all of the interpretation presented in here, but most of it's fairly general and most of it's fairly, I think, difficult to argue with, because it hasn't gone into a huge amount of depth on any one subject, which is where the argument normally comes from in between different interpreters of a source. Instead, it looks at more big picture stuff and top level and basics, which generally speaking, we all more or less agree with most of the core material that we study. Then it goes into the weapon, after that, chapter 3 onwards goes into broken down by weapon categories. Now, this doesn't cover everything from the medieval and Renaissance sources, but what it focuses on is the biggest, most popular, you could say in treatise terms, the most important weapons or weapon sets featured in the treatises in this period. So first up, and I think correctly, is longsword. Okay, chapter 3 is all about the longsword. Chapter 4 is all about sword and buckler. Now I think that's correct, because if we look at the earliest medieval sources, indeed they are dominated by longsword material and sword and buckler material. And some people will be shouting and going, oh, but what about wrestling? What about dagger? Yes, that's there as well. That'll be dealt with a little bit later. But definitely longsword and sword and buckler are not only dealt with in a lot of the treatises that we have available to us. There's a lot of ink and illustrations spent on those two weapon sets, but additionally they were very, very important weapons, particularly dueling weapons and one-on-one combat weapons in this period. And of course most people study them, so if you're doing medieval martial arts, the chances are that you either do longsword or sword and buckler or both. Next up is sword and shield. Now sword and shield is a difficult one because we don't have a huge amount of sword and shield material, and that's one of the reasons why Eric has used some plates from Talhofer showing the dueling shield and discussing, I suppose, the difficult topic of creating a sword and large shield system, or recreating a sword and shield system based on the available source material, because we do have some sword and shield sources, Marozzo for example, with sword and rotella, once we get into the 16th century, but we don't, for the medieval period, for the 15th century and early, we don't have an awful lot of sword and shield material explicitly described, but nevertheless we know that it was highly important, obviously up until the 14th century, and to a large degree used by certain troop types in the 14th and 15th century as well. But sword and shield, very important weapon combination, probably understudied, underexposed in medieval HEMA because we don't have an awful lot of source material for it, but nevertheless it has earned its chapter in this book, rightly so. Chapter 6, called The Forgotten, is sword and cloak, sword and dagger, and paired swords. And I think that's right that it's in here. And at this point I'll also mention that what this book does is a little bit similar to what some YouTube channels do, like my channel and various others out there, in that we try to cover all of the topics that there is source material for. And so what Eric has done correctly in this book is basically broken down the chapters into the individual weapon sets, but also they are of course all ones that are, number one, important, number two, people are interested in them and practicing them, and number three, there is source material for it. So it is a HEMA book, and it does refer to source material as well as interpretations thereof. The next chapter is on knives and daggers, correctly, because as mentioned, that's very important in both the medieval and the Renaissance material. Next up is great swords, which I've just done a video about. Again, very, very important because it is like longsword, it is related to longsword, but there is material that is specific to the great sword, which is separate from the longsword treatises, particularly the Iberian Montante material, but also Italian Spadone, and some of the German sources which are more related to the earlier longsword stuff. But there is great sword material which is distinct and separate to some degree from the longsword material. Next up, and this is I really love that this is included in here. So this is chapter 9, and it's called The Unseen. What about axes and maces? And I think it's great that that has earned its chapter in this book, because As I've spoken about many times on this channel, axes and maces and warhammers, extremely important in the medieval period, particularly in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries and into the 16th, but they are completely neglected, or almost completely neglected, in the source material. There is very, very little technical data in any treatises telling us how to use these weapons. So that chapter is talking about that, and well, you can read it for yourself, hopefully. And then the next two chapters are both on pole weapons. The first one is on thrusting polearms, obviously spears and their kin. Absolutely correct that that should be in there and be first. And the next one's on cutting polearms. Obviously polearms not that can only cut, but can additionally cut halberds and bills. And then chapter 12 is based on armoured fighting. Now, personally, I possibly would have put the armoured fighting in earlier, particularly because it relates to the longsword material and some of the earlier period material. You know, that was Eric's choice, and I can understand why. You know, everything that's come up to that point is essentially blossfechten or unarmoured fighting, so I can understand why you might decide to leave the armoured section till last, although chronologically maybe doesn't make sense because you've kind of looked through some Renaissance sources and then gone back to Fiore and other earlier medieval sources in armour. But anyway, it's in there, and that's the important thing. And then, you know, there's a couple of sort of concluding, I would describe them as concluding chapters. So really it's an overview of the most popular and debatably the most important sections or types of HEMA that there is to study, that we have source material for, and that people do practice and use. So check it out. Obviously linked below, as always. Eric Lowe, The Use of Medieval Weaponry, but it is medieval and Renaissance weaponry. It doesn't have a lot of rapier material in there, but it does discuss 16th century sources as well. So it's kind of like, it's almost up to the period of rapiers, I'd say, without necessarily including very much of that material in there. And it's got references on the back from Jake Norwood and Jarek Swanger, Mike Cole as well. So it's you know, I think it's a book that's well worth checking out. It's not an expensive book in the big scheme of things. So if you want to learn more about HEMA, or if you're relatively new to HEMA, or if you, like some of my students, just focus on one or two particular types of HEMA and you want to learn a little bit more, then check out this book, linked below. Thanks for watching. See you really soon on Schola Gladiatoria channel for another video. Cheers, folks.